Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Performing and Visual Arts, SOPVA. Diploma Programmes, Diploma in Theatre Arts, DTH BTH1 Understanding Drama. Block-2 Macbeth. Unit-1 Background Study to the Play and Discussion, Act 1. 1.1 Introduction. We are now ready to embark upon what we hope will prove to be a journey of discovery as we go through the play together. Before we begin, a word of explanation about the method that we will be using. We will follow the text of the play scene by scene from beginning to end. For each scene we will try to provide some critical annotation, comment and analysis. There will be an introduction to each act, in which we will attempt to point out some themes, ideas and other important aspects of that act. Our effort will be to present you with as complete a picture of the play as possible, giving you as many readings of the play as we can, so that, at the end of the exercise, you can formulate your own opinions and ideas of the play yourself. While we will not cite critics by name, we will try and give you most of the major critical approaches to the play. Needless to say, these units can only form the core of your study of Macbeth. The rest you must provide for yourself through secondary reading. 1.2 Shakespeare. Let us try and place this particular tragedy, Macbeth, in the larger context of the Shakespearean canon. Born in 1564, William Shakespeare's first play, Henry VI, was written in the years 1589 to 90. These dates are the most widely accepted by Shakespeare scholars since there is great debate over the precise dating of his plays. In a career spanning almost 25 years, from 1589 to 1613, Shakespeare wrote a total of 36 plays, of which Macbeth is among the last few, being the 28th. In the course of his writing, Shakespeare made use of a wide variety of genres, writing tragedies, histories, comedies and romances with equal ease and effect, and even creating a few new genres which, being difficult to place, we call the problem plays. It is possible to see a rough pattern in the writing of these different kinds of plays. For instance, most of the history plays were written very early in his career, even though the very last play written, Henry VIII, is a history play. Similarly, beginning with the comedy of Errors and Two Gentlemen of Verona, the bulk of the comedies seem to follow. Although the comedies are interspersed with some early tragedies like Romeo and Juliet and Titus Andronicus, most of the tragedies come together after the comedies. Hence, between 1599 and 1608, Shakespeare wrote Ham/She detailing King Lear, Macbeth, Antony, and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Timon of Athens. Following this turbulent and anguished phase come the romances which scholars call Shakespeare's reconciliation with the dark world of the tragedies. Shakespeare's creative genius is also evidenced in sonnets written in the 1590s. The sonnets numbering 154, of which 126 are addressed to a friend and the other 28 to his mistress or dark lady, are known for their impersonal pronouncements. 1.3 Shakespearean tragedy. Perhaps such a division has some bearing on Shakespeare's worldview and can help us to better understand his idea of what constituted a tragedy or comedy. It is always dangerous to assume that he started out with a particular theory of what a tragedy should be, and proceeded to write plays that conform to this framework. What is far more probable is that, given a fundamental vision, the tragedy worked out its own form in the course of writing the play. Indeed, many of our notions of what constitutes a tragedy are derived from a study of Shakespeare's plays. A good way to try and define a Shakespearean tragedy is to follow a similar path, that is, to begin with a very general idea of tragedy and then let our reading of the play itself evolve a definition. Therefore, we are going to place before you a few ideas that you can keep in mind while reading the play and then affirm, modify or discard them as you go along. According to one theory, a tragedy explores man's relationship with the universe, while a comedy concentrates on man's relationship with society. That is, a tragedy deals with the coming to terms of human beings with forces larger and greater than themselves, such as fate or death. In the course of this clash, the nature of the force as well as the nature of man is studied and laid bare. Hence, a tragedy usually concerns itself with questions about man's very existence, the meaning and purpose of his life and his place in the universe. Since the human being must necessarily be defeated in a conflict with such powerful forces, the Shakespearean tragedy always ends with the death of the protagonist. However, even though the end is unhappy and seems fatalistic, there is some value held out at the end of the play. This is usually the courage and strength of the protagonist. His determination to fight against great odds, often in the knowledge of certain defeat for the values he believes in, and the fact that, in spite of his death, he has made his mark in the world, somehow changing things for the better. This is true of almost every Shakespearean tragic hero that you can think of, whether it is Othello, King Lear or Coriolanus. 1.4 Introduction to Macbeth. If you have read the play, you will perceive a flaw in this theory immediately. It might have occurred to you, that is, that Macbeth the protagonist in the play is a man with many heinous crimes on his head. He begins by killing the king, Duncan, then the Lord Banquo, then Lady Macduff with all her children and household, and goes on to unleash a reign of the utmost terror and cruelty, committing unspecified but such horrible crimes that finally, his own subjects rise up against him and kill him. What values, you might ask, can such a man possibly affirm, and in what sense are we to consider him a hero? This is not a question that we are going to address ourselves to immediately, although we will discuss it at length when the time comes. But we do want you to keep in mind the fact that even for Shakespeare's own contemporary audience, this question was a frequently asked and valid one. The Elizabethan audience was familiar with a certain notion of the tragic hero, and for them, too, Macbeth was a problematic protagonist. This needs to be said in order, or us to be aware that Shakespeare has consciously denied the expectations of the audience in the creation of Macbeth as hero, and that our job is to try and discover what the reasons behind this startling decision were. While these are some questions that we are going to ask as our reading of the play progresses, it is good to remember that we can only provide a few basic ideas, theories and opinions. Ultimately, you must decide for yourselves what you think and how you feel about each issue that will be raised. To make sure that your opinion is an educated and informed one, it is always helpful to have a few facts about the play that you can refer to and make inferences from. Some of these are given below, and we shall try to provide as many of them as are irrelevant as we go along. 1.5 Sources and historical facts. We know, first, that the main plot was not of Shakespeare's own making. He had recourse to several sources from where he may have got the story from. These are Holinshed's Chronicles, which consisted of the lives of various kings and important figures covering almost every one of any note in England, Ireland and Scotland, real and legendary, 3 books by Reginald Scott, Discovery of Witchcraft, News from Scotland and Demonology, William Stewart's Book of the Chronicles of Scotland, metrical and expanded version of Hector Boss's Chronicles of Scotland translated by John Bellenden, and perhaps, the most influential of all, a book on witchcraft, written by none other than King James I himself, who was known to have a strong interest in witchcraft and the supernatural. James I took over the throne from Queen Elizabeth I in 1603 and had been in power for 2 or 3 years when the play was written. While Shakespeare must have got the broad outlines from any or all of these sources, the important thing to remember is that he molded the given facts into a new, profound and powerful work of art. Whether his facts are accurate or not, or whether anyone by the name of Macbeth ever even existed, is irrelevant to us, because the play Macbeth stands as an entity by itself, relevant, not for its historical, but for its human and philosophical value. Why, then, are sources so important to the Shakespeare scholar? First, when we say that the play is not important for its historical accuracy, we mean that it cannot be used as a historical document by which we can ascertain historical events or people. The play does, however, have historical value regarding the age that it was written in. That is, Macbeth can tell us something about the England of the last decades of Elizabeth's reign and the first few of that of James. In other words, the play is a historical document, not of Macbeth's Scotland, but of Shakespeare's England. 1.5.1 Tudor Propaganda. In what sense this is true, we will see as we go through the play. For now, it is enough for us to keep in mind that the theme of Macbeth was pertinent enough in the context of the political situation of Shakespeare's own day. Towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, the matter of succession to the throne became one of increasing concern to the court. Being unmarried, Elizabeth had no natural heir, and this fact fueled the latent ambition in many members of the aristocracy. At the same time, charges were being leveled against her, accusing her of being an incompetent monarch. The seriousness of these charges can only be gauged if one connects them with the then prevalent theory of the divine right of kingship. This theory maintains that in keeping with the great chain of image of all creation extending downwards from God at the top, to his representative on earth, the Pope, to the king, below whom come men, women, animals and vegetables in that order, the king, therefore, is the image of God on earth. He has, that is, a divine lay sanctioned right to rule, and anyone opposing that right commits a sin against God himself. Since this theory served the interests of the monarchy so well, the Tudor dynasty did its best to propagate it as far and as wide as possible, in an attempt to instill in the people a divine awe of the monarch and an almost religious fear of rebellion against the throne. In Macbeth, we can clearly see the effect of these ideas at work in the particular political scenario of the last years of Elizabeth's reign. The Scotland of the play had no law of dynastic succession, holding, instead, that the person most worthy of the throne should be nominated by the king and thereafter elected by the court. This procedure raises a few questions pertinent to Shakespeare's own time, concerning the problem of dynastic succession if the ruler is not competent, and the unsatisfied ambitions of other noblemen who feel that their claim to the throne is greater and that it has been unfairly thwarted. Finally, there is one last theory that we must take into account if we are to fathom this play at all, and that is the notion of natural order widely held by Elizabethan England. We have already seen this exemplified in the great chain of being theory. Imagine this idea extended and expanded to encompass all of creation and all earthly and otherworldly matters. At the foundation of this theory lay the idea that God is evident in the immense order to be found in nature. All things which could be classified as natural were, by definition, good, because they reflected the goodness and order of God. Hence, anything that went contrary to the natural order and was unnatural was evil. If you connect the two above ideas of the divine right of kingship and natural order, you will begin to understand the potent and complex formula that was Tudor propaganda. While some section of the population may actually have believed these ideas, the poorer and more illiterate sections of society, for instance the vast majority, were bombarded with this propaganda by the aristocracy and clergy. It was used as a tool of repression by the court to keep rebellion in check, by the church in order to make the masses more subservient and pliable to its dictates, and by men in order to keep women in what they considered to be their place. 1.5.2 Renaissance England. Propaganda of this sort is, by its very nature, an aggressive propagation of ideas which are not otherwise held by the people. That is, the more men are inclined towards rebellion, the louder will the monarch talk about the divine sanction of his or her rule, or, the more capable and intelligent are women found to be, the more vociferously will they be reminded that their place is inferior to men according to the law of God. In short, the Elizabethan age was one which saw the burgeoning of awareness and a sense of individuality and a breaking free from the medieval notions of men's inherent sinfulness and inferiority. The Renaissance saw to it that men and women alike were rediscovering the world anew and redefining their place in it. How anachronistic the ideas propagated by the Tudors were can best be seen in the most glaringly obvious example possible. The fact that a woman lower than men on the chain and therefore inferior to them was, in fact, king. That all men owed allegiance to an inferior being whose species owed its allegiance to men was a problem that various apologists of the Tudor court and clergy tied themselves up in knots trying to explain. In spite of this prime instance to the contrary, however, the myth that women were born inferior by the divine will of God was vehemently preached by clergymen and scholars alike. A word about witchcraft, since it has such a dominant role to play in Macbeth. In spite of the learning and awareness that came with the Renaissance, the medieval practice of burning witches at the stake was still to be seen in England. In fact, belief in witchcraft was much more prevalent than it seemed possible, given the degree of change that was sweeping the country. Some of these women were genuine victims of the gross ignorance of the people, sometimes even of a vicious malice. All too often, though, a woman was burned at the witch's stake merely because she was a widow and not only had no male to protect and justify her existence, but also because she had property belonging to her dead husband. Since the laws concerning women's rights to property were not in the interests of women, a widow, unable to protect her property, was accused of indulging in black magic and burned and her property seized by either the village or the church or both. We will have more than occasion enough to discuss each of the above ideas as we go through the pliers. A good socio-historical perspective on these issues is essential if we wish to uncover some of its complexity. Suffice it for now to say that the Elizabethan age was one in which great social and philosophical changes were fermenting, clashing with entrenched ideologies that were either remnants of the medieval ages or salvaged from the past and propagated by people with vested interests. How these are reflected in Shakespeare's play and what use he makes of them we shall see in a reading of Macbeth. 1.6 Macbeth, Act 1. The first act of the well-made play of 5 acts was usually used by the playwright as an expository act. That is, it introduced the spectator to the world of the play by introducing all the major characters and presenting the fundamentals of the plot. In doing so, most of the major themes that the play is going to concern itself with are also introduced in nascent form. We can also find the main images and symbols that will dominate the play as it unfolds in the first act itself. In the case of Macbeth, these observations can easily be borne out. The protagonist, Macbeth, his wife, Lady Macbeth, the king, Duncan, the noble, Lord Banquo, are all brought onto the stage and their status and prominent characteristics established. Also, the plot is well chalked out. There has been a war of rebellion against the king, Duncan, which Macbeth has suppressed almost single-handedly. Although he has been well rewarded for his part in the wars, Duncan nominates his son, Malcolm, as the heir to the throne. Macbeth, who is well aware that his rightful reward should have been the throne, feels wronged, and, egged on by his wife and the prophecy of the witches, decides to kill Duncan. The first act closes upon a troubled Macbeth battling with his conscience, on the verge of committing this most heinous of crimes. 1.6.1 Act 1, Scene I. Now let us go through this progression scene by scene. The play opens in an extremely disturbing manner. The witches on the heath, a vast, open space with no vegetation except for wild trees and shrubs, enter amid thunder and lightning, chanting strange lines which seem to have no meaning or bearing to the story. What, then, is the significance of this dark, wild scene? First, it is important to know that this scene can be seen in the tradition of the ancient Greek tragedies, which always opened with the riddle of the Sibyl. The Sibyl was a mythological creature which was believed to have immortal life, and therefore, to know everything. This Sibyl usually asked the protagonist a riddle which, if he or she could answer, they would thrive, and if not, would be pursued by a relentless and cruel fate. Not only do the witches have some of this Sibylline quality, speaking in enigmatic riddles which trap Macbeth who cannot understand the full meaning of their prophecies, but the entire scene is as a riddle for the reader or spectator to unravel. To begin with, what do the witches really mean when they say when the hurly-burly's done / when the battle's lost and won? Does the burly refer merely to the storm that is raging, or does it refer to the storm that is about to be unleashed in the life of Macbeth? What is the battle that they speak of? Merely the one that we will be told about in the next scene, or the battle that it will engender in Macbeth's soul? In what sense is the battle lost and won? Will Macbeth win this earthly battle but lose his soul in the struggle? Is it not true, moreover, that it is through winning one battle, the war that he has just fought, that he will lose another, because the ambition that seizes his soul, leading to the murder, causes him to lose in his struggle against evil? The witches depart with the lines, "Fair is foul and foul is fair" / hover through the fog and filthier. Some critics feel that these lines sum up the entire atmosphere of the play. That is, the world of Macbeth is a world in which good and bad are irretrievably mixed together, in which good can, in fact, become bad, and bad, good. The moral world of the play, thus, is seen to be one of great chaos, in which, instead of God, witches are left to oversee human affairs. Hence, the wasted, wild heath itself becomes symbolic of the moral corruption of the world, and the storm can be seen as symptomatic of this chaos reflected in nature. The play, indeed, seems set in a place where the air is filthy, not literally, since the open plains of Scotland are far from being polluted, but symbolically, in the sense that corruption has gone so deep that the very air seems dirty.
The reader or spectator who is able to understand this will understand the rest of the play as well, and if Macbeth is able to comprehend the true meaning of the witches and his experience on the heath, he, too, will be able to escape a tragic fate. In this context, it is interesting to note that the witches have been compared to the three blind sisters who are the three fates of Greek mythology, because they seem to control human destiny. It should be remembered, however, that though the Greek fates are all-powerful, their blindness symbolizes their complete indifference to the fate of the people whose lives they control. The witches, on the other hand, seem to be positively malicious, going out of their way to harm and mislead their victims. This has also been seen as being due to the fact that Macbeth does, indeed, have a terrible life ahead of him, and the witches merely symbolize the predestined horror of Macbeth's life. 1.6.2 Act 1, Scene 2. Following the Greek tradition, the hero is introduced through the technique of a conversation conducted by other people that enumerates his heroic qualities. We have put heroic in quotation marks because, although these qualities are praised by the people in question, it is left up to the reader/spectator to decide whether or not they constitute heroism. A good illustration is the introduction of Macbeth. In I, 2, everyone praises his fighting prowess in superlatives. It would seem, therefore, that Macbeth's heroism lies in his being a good soldier. However, take another look at the way in which these powers are described. Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution. The soldier recounting the tale wonders if they Macbeth and Bank were meant to bathe in reeking wounds / or memorize another Golgotha. Not only are these descriptions meant to arouse repulsion in the reader, even the allusions used for Macbeth are not very elevating. He's called Valor's minion, that is, slave, and as you might know, Golgotha, in biblical mythology, is known as the place of skulls. Its perpetrators are remembered with fear and loathing rather than respected as good warriors. Finally, the recounting of Macbeth's heroism ends with the soldier fainting away from loss of blood and pain from his own wounds, a reminder of the goriness of war that overwhelms all rhetoric of honor and courage. What is the point of all this? Perhaps it is that although a particular age and culture upholds and honors bravery in war, it can also, at the same time, lose sight of the fact that war entails a certain kind of barbarism in its physical violence and disregard of human life and worth? If this is so, then is sheer physical courage heroic if the soldier becomes merely an instrument of destruction? What place do the virtues of mercy and compassion have in such a culture? We will see the importance of these questions as Macbeth gets ready to commit a deed that is thought to be the worst of all crimes, regicide, or the killing of the king. The question that we will be faced with is why killing and lack of compunction is praised in one case, war, and punished in another, regicide. Moreover, if you train a soldier to live the violent and cruel life of a warrior, is it not unreasonable to expect him to live according to very different values when the war is over? And is it his fault if he is unable to do so? These are questions that Shakespeare is particularly concerned with at the time that he writes Othello, Macbeth, and Coriolanus. All plays that take up this issue in various ways. Lastly, Duncan's words, "Go pronounce his death" and with his former title Great Macbeth, are significant in the light of the witch's enigmatic statement about the battle being lost and won. What the Thane of Cawdor has lost, his title Macbeth has won. But is it not equally true that Cawdor has lost also the trust and favor of the king and won a death sentence, which is to be Macbeth's fate also? We will find as we go along that the prophecies of the witches proved to be true in a similarly ironic fashion. 1.6.3 Act 1, Scene 3. That the seemingly meaningless utterances of the witches are ridden with hidden meaning is emphasized in the opening lines of this scene. The sailor's wife who defies the witch and incurs her wrath in the form of revenge upon her husband coming home could well be Lady Macbeth. Similarly, the revenge that the witch takes upon the hapless sailor is, metaphorically, the fate that Macbeth will be faced with. He, too, shall be denied sleep, and live the life of a man forbid. He, too, shall dwindle, peak and pine, and, like the sailor's boat, the boat or ship being a traditional image for the soul, Macbeth's soul, too, shall be tempest-tossed before he is able to redeem it. The soul, like the sailor's boat, according to Christian theology, cannot be lost. Hence, just as the witch refers to the sailor who was wrecked as he was on his way home, the arrival of Macbeth on the scene is announced. Reading this scene, it is impossible for the reader to escape the feeling that Macbeth's fate has been sealed. Like the charm of the witches, it is wound up. With his first words, Macbeth reveals himself already open and vulnerable to the influences. So foul and fair a day I have not seen, echoes the words of the witches. Fair is foul and foul is fair, indicating to the reader that Macbeth shares in the dark world of the witches in some deep, inscrutable way. We can be quite sure that the witches will exploit this weakness in order to ruin Macbeth. In this he is contrasted with Banquo, who seems to be much more practical and down to earth, as his remarks upon the distance yet to be covered and the appearance of the witches shows. His reaction to the prophecy of the witches is also very different compared to Macbeth's. While Macbeth immediately begins to speculate and ponder upon the enigmatic sayings of the witches, Banquo seems to regard them with some skepticism and feels that things should be left up to fate. Some critics feel that Banquo is as ambitious as Macbeth, but since the prophecy does not immediately require him to do anything, he can afford to sit back and watch whatever turn events might take. After all, first Macbeth has to make himself king, only then can Banquo's children ascend the throne. Nothing is required from Banquo since nothing has been prophesied for him personally, and he can afford to neither beg nor fear their fevers or their hate. As the truth of some of the prophecies is proved to Macbeth by the arrival of Ross, he is plunged in meditation. The thought of regicide occurs to him almost immediately. He does not even stop to think that perhaps the king will nominate him to the throne himself. Ross does, in fact, speak of some great honor to which the title of Cawdor is but an earnest. Significantly, before Ross announces that the title of Cawdor has been conferred upon him, Macbeth considers the chances of his becoming king not to stand within the prospect of belief. The importance of this scene lies not only in what the first reactions of Banquo and Macbeth tell us about their respective characters, but also in what it tells us about the nature of the witches. While Banquo unthinkingly assumes that they are evil and regards them as the devil's emissaries, Macbeth's conjectures are more complex. As the ghost of Hamlet's father in Hamlet, it is difficult to ascertain whether the supernatural agents are good or evil ones. We, who have prior knowledge of the witches and have seen them in action, tend to regard them as wholly evil. But for Macbeth, they are merely supernatural agents who have, so far, told him no more than the truth. Moreover, they have prophesied nothing but good for him, and he has neither reason nor inclination to believe that they are evil. The true nature of the witches is important when we turn to the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for Macbeth's decision to murder Duncan? The witches, by prophesying Macbeth's kingship, or Macbeth himself, who leaps with such unholy alacrity to the conclusion that Duncan will have to be killed, or have the witches merely externalize the innermost ambitions of Macbeth, functioning as personifications of his thoughts? This is a question that we will have occasion to discuss in great detail as we go through the play. For now, it is enough to note that, in spite of his thoughts, Macbeth is content to leave his future to chance which, if it will have him king, can crown him without his stir. 1.7 Summary. In this unit, we have seen the plot being unfolded, the main characters introduced and the major themes and issues outlined. Many questions have been raised, and each issue can be seen from many angles. This unit has given us the main points of view, and left the questions open for further discussion. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.